All right, thanks for joining us for today's webinar. We're really excited to talk about GeoEvent Server and Esri and where WDT's data can work in the Esri interface. Joined today by Matt Gaffner, our GIS weather solution expert. Matt, you're fresh off an Esri user conference in San Diego. How long were you out there again?
Almost a week.
A week. Just a huge turnout again. What a pretty incredible show. Everybody that goes there says it's one of the best of the year, and just a massive turnout. Matt, we've worked in the Esri space for a very long time. You've been with WDT now for 11 years, doing some form of weather data and Esri that entire time. It's been neat to see Esri continue to innovate and just become a powerhouse in the geospatial space and really become able to use weather data even better than before. And weather being one of the most geospatial data sets there is, WDT being a data provider in Esri is just a wonderful fit and a great partnership with us. But the question you get, the question I get from everybody we talk to about WDT's work and weather inside of GIS is, what can you do with weather in GIS inside of Esri? And I'm excited for us to talk about that today. We'll at least give one use case of the million use cases of how we can use weather data inside of Esri to help your business. And Matt, today is a good day to talk about it.
Yeah, for sure. There's obviously, like you said, there's a ton of things that you can do with weather data in the Esri platform. We've been a business partner for 14 or 15 years now, and I remember early in my career, wanting to be able to do more with weather data, real-time data. Within the Esri platform, and in the last 3 or 4 years, they've really added a lot of functionality, and they keep making it easier and able to handle bigger data sets that update more dynamically and rapidly. So it really kind of sets the stage for the presentation that I gave at the Esri user conference. So this is kind of going back over the same presentation that I gave at the user conference. And it was interesting to go back to the title slide. They keep changing things and making updates. And when I submitted my abstract to give that talk, it was actually submitted under Gaining Insights using the GeoEvent processor. But sometime between the abstract deadline and the actual presentation that I gave, I think it was at the Esri Partner Conference, they actually changed it back from the GeoEvent processor to the GeoEvent server. So I had to kind of go back and update that. But, to start out, I kind of want to answer the question why, and I think why use the GeoEvent server comes down to 3 basic ideas: automation, customization, and prioritization. There's all kinds of cool things that you can do from an automation standpoint. The GeoEvent server lets you send SMS messages or email messages, and one of the things I've been kind of working and playing around with is using if this then that, which if you guys haven't heard of if this then that, or IFTY, you should check it out. It's really cool. They have a bunch of recipes that you can use to basically automate things. And so one of the things that I've been wanting to do is, if there's lightning near my house, or if there's an SPC outlook for severe weather for my house or work, I kind of wanted to use the GeoEvent server to send an email to IFTY that would then turn on an outlet, Wi-Fi enabled outlet in my house, or turn on a light. You could have a light or a siren plugged in. So there's cool automation things that you can do that obviously have business implications and applications as well. Customization, I've been to a whole lot of keynote addresses in my career, but one of the things that stands out, and I wish I could remember who said it, was we live in a world of mass customization. We can create all the data services using all the Esri tools on the ArcGIS server side of things, but we're never going to be able to customize alerts for all the different industries that we serve, whether it's aviation, agriculture, utilities, oil and gas, or agriculture. There's just too many things, and we're never going to be the experts, but we know our customers are the experts in that. And so they can utilize the GeoEvent server as a way to customize their own weather-related alerts. The other thing too is prioritization. We live in a world where there's so much data out there that this slide, this little image on the slide, there's a guy at the user conference who actually kind of stood up to take a picture. I was like, you're more than welcome to take a picture, but by all means know that this is a great example of a terrible map where I just threw all of our data on. You can barely see the pipelines that this was mapped over, and it doesn't really make sense. And there's kind of another analog in the weather world where the Weather Service used to have this goal of getting as much data to their forecasters as fast as possible so they could issue alerts as quickly as possible. But now there's almost a paralysis by analysis because they have so much data updating so frequently that they can't actually process it mentally fast enough to make good decisions. And that's where things like the GeoEvent Server come in, where you can analyze the data in a real-time, automated fashion and draw somebody's attention, maybe on an operations dashboard, to something that you want them to see. Maybe it's lighting your substation or outdoor workers that you may have in the field. So we'll talk a little bit about the paradigm. You know, a lot of Esri examples show dynamic assets intersecting a geofence. You can see in the GIF, I've got a little dot representing a truck that drives into a industrial facility. It changes the symbology. Turns it green so that you know that he's in there. We've also got the paradigm of a dynamic asset intersecting a dynamic geofence. I think the best way to explain that is maybe like Air Force One flying around with a 10-mile buffer around it. You've got a dynamic asset and it might intersect various airspace or whatnot. And all of those points and polygons are going to have object IDs that are tied to those particular assets. And then the one that we're going to talk about, the example that I'm going to walk through here, is a static asset being intersected with dynamic geofences. That's typically what we see our customers do, whether it's assets that they have for their business, offices, substations, power lines, all that kind of stuff, being intersected with dynamic weather data that's rapidly updating. This GIF here shows our time-enabled radar map service. You can see it's approaching a segment of pipeline, and when it gets to 40 DBZ, or kind of that first orange color, it lights up that segment of pipeline by changing the value of the feature service, which can be done through the GeoEvent Server. But one thing to note is obviously the pipeline is static, but the storms aren't. So every time step as you go through there, all those polygons, even though they look like they're kind of continuing through time, will have a new object ID. So that kind of creates some challenges that we had to get over as we were kind of first starting to play with the GeoEvent Server. Here's another little example of our, this is our hail data set. We've called it Hail Express, but it's polygons that update every 5 minutes that show where the hail was, how big it was. So at this one particular time step, there's 2 polygons that show up. So it may be object ID 1 and object ID 2, and you step through and 5 minutes later, this is what you have. So all the polygons are different. None of them really went from time A to time B. So that kind of creates an extra step that we have to work through, and we'll get through that. I'm sure most people on this webinar are well aware of what a geofence is. If I ask you from that map what the geofence is, everybody's probably going to tell me it's the green polygons, and that's right. It's intended to be a boundary or an area geographically. But as we kind of work through this example, we're going to have to think about that a little bit differently in order to get it to do what we wanted. Now, the use case that we're going to walk through, we're going to use the Storm Prediction Center's daily severe weather outlook. It's kind of a common use case that kind of apply to a lot of things, and it can allow for some customization of how you might want to generate an alert that gets sent to an end user, whether it's through an email or a mobile device. First off, you have to start with an input connector. We're going to use the Pole and ArcGIS server for features, which is one of the built-in common input connectors. This is what the data service looks like. The Storm Prediction Center issues polygons, WDT ingests those. We make them all a feature service, so it's super easy to pull into anything on the Esri platform. And it's also supported 24/7 as well through our ArcGIS server infrastructure. So you can see there's categorical risk of thunderstorms. So keep that in mind as we step through and we try to intersect this with points. In this particular example, we're going to intersect them with points that show our WDT employees' home locations. Like I said, you can see the Poland ArcGIS server is right there at the top of the list. There's several ways that you can ingest data into the GeoEvent server. So once we get started here, this is the dialog box that'll come up, and we'll have to give it a name. So we did SPC, Storm Prediction Center, Severe Weather Outlook Day 1. And then you have to connect it to an ArcGIS server. And you can, in this particular case, we're using a staging server that we run, but if you were a customer of WDT's, you would connect to our operational server. We have to go through, pick the folder, the service, and then the particular layer from that service. The Storm Prediction Center has a day 1, a day 2, and a day 3 Outlook, but in this case, we're just going to use the day 1. Other things that we have to get set up are the refresh interval. We chose every 60 seconds. That might have been too frequent, but it brings up a good talking point. This data set updates about 3 times a day. So if you want to make sure that you get an update or an alert sent as soon as it's available, then you could use 60 seconds or less, or you could do every 5 or 15 minutes. You don't need to do it that frequently, especially because this isn't a critical alert that there's a tornado on the ground and you need to get it really quickly. Now, you have to fill out too as well the method to identify incremental updates. We're going to use the timestamp, and the time field to identify incremental updates is the date time received, or the date received, which are all fields that are available with this feature service. Now, this is kind of one of the things that we struggled to kind of get through mentally when we were working with this example was the Geofence, because in this case we were using point locations as a geofence. So we're going to go ahead and add that, and it brings up a dialog box that's very similar. We've already connected to the staging server, so that's there, and it lets you from drop-down menus pick out what folder you want to grab data from, the name of the service in the particular layer, and in this case, the test points layer is the point locations for our homes that we were wanting to send alerts for. And then the category was the category of the SPC alert, whether it's high risk, moderate risk, so on and so forth. We set this to update every 24 hours. We're not maintaining it operationally. If you were doing this with automated vehicle location stuff, you could do it every minute or less, but daily was perfectly fine for this example. So we're going to go through, create our GeoEvent service, give it a name, and then the whole process works through this GUI, and it's a really intuitive process where you can drag and drop inputs, outputs, along with filters and processors into the workspace and just kind of connect them. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to grab the SPC Severe Weather Outlook Day 1 input connector that we just set up to the workspace. Then you've got filters and processors you can work with, and in this case, we're going to start by using a processor called the GeoTagger, and we'll just click on that, drag it into the workspace. Now, the one thing to note, I took my screenshots at the wrong time, so it wouldn't come up with the name GeoTagger in here. You have to double click on there, and when you do, you get a dialog box for the processor, and you're going to choose the GeoTagger dropdown. And we're going to select the geofence that we want, and this little syntax says use all of the points in this particular feature service called home that we already connected to as one of our geofences. And then we're going to use the spatial operator contains any. So we want any SPC polygons that contain any of our homes. And once we've got that set up, we've got the GeoTagger processor done. And basically what the GeoTagger is going to do is tag any of the SPC polygons that contain any of our WDT employee home locations. From there, we're going to grab a filter and we're going to drag it on there. We're going to filter those geotag polygons that we just went through. Again, it wouldn't have this text here until you double click on it, go through the dialog process and give it a name like we did up here. And so to filter the geotag polygons, we're going to say for any of the SPC polygons with a geometry that contains any of our home, assets, we're going to use that for a filter. Now, if we go back and look at the Storm Prediction Center polygons, for example, it has thunderstorm, marginal, slight, enhanced, moderate, and high. We don't care about thunderstorm. It's not really a big risk factor for what we're worried about. So we're going to add another layer to the filter, and we're going to say, and when the SPC category doesn't equal thunderstorm. So we're going to just eliminate those from the process so we don't create extraneous alerts that are too frequent and don't really have a lot of consequence. From there, we're going to grab another filter and drag it into the space. And what we're going to do is filter out the various polygons that could be intersecting our assets. Again, it's another simple filter where we say SPC category equals MDT, which stands for moderate. That's the raw format that we get the data in. We're going to do something about it so it's a little bit more human readable later. We could do the same thing for slight and high risk as well. I'm not going to walk everybody through it since it would just be redundant. And you can obviously go back and watch a video of the webinar if you need to see how to step through it. But from there, we're going to grab another processor, which is called the field calculator. A lot of people that have been using Esri stuff for a long time have used this in desktop and other applications. And what we're going to do, again, it wouldn't have a name here yet. We double click on that, open it up, and go to the dialog box and choose the field calculator. And we named it replace MDT because what we want to do is we want to use a simple expression that says replace all from the category field that have MDT and replace it with moderate risk of severe weather. And we want this to create a new field called risk. And then you can tell it what format or field type you want that new field to have. So that's what we're going to do with the field calculator. And then we're going to grab one more processor. It's called the field splitter. We're going to drag that over. One thing to note, the field splitter is not out of the box part of the GeoEvent server, but it is something that you can get from the Esri gallery. We'll go over that in just a little bit. But basically, it's going to split the geofences and make it kind of a comma delimited list, which helps kind of in the downstream process. But it's a really simple dialog box to work with in this particular case. Again, picking field splitter from the processor list. Here's a list of all of the out-of-the-box processors. And like I said, you can get the field splitter from the Esri gallery and just include it with your installation since it's not out of the box. It's not hard to do. One of the last things we want to do is another processor that we'll drag in there, and it's called the field enricher. And what the field enricher is going to do when you double click on that, obviously we're going to pick the field enricher from the drop-down box. We gave it the obvious name of field enricher. But then we go through and we need to pick that data service that we're using for our geofence and pick our basically test points, which was our WDT employee home locations. And we're going to enrich those fields with the name, email, and phone numbers from that list, which is going to be useful in our output connector. And speaking of output connectors, we're going to go ahead and build the output connector. We have to do that before we drag it into the workspace. And so it's really easy. Obviously, you give it a name, a sender. You have to define the recipient and their particular phone number, but you can use a variable to do so. And then I've seen examples where some people will build their input connectors and output connectors before they do the whole process. If you know where you're going, that's great. But in this particular case, we didn't know we wanted it to read. The SPC has issued we used that risk variable that we created in the process so that it would be a plain English moderate risk of severe weather over the asset name. So in this case, it made more sense for us to do it after the fact and then come back. We can go over to the outputs, drag it right into the GeoEvent manager and get it connected. Now, once we've got to this point, our service, our GeoEvent process is done. You just need to go up click publish and then make sure that you've got your input running and that the service is running. And the end result here's a screenshot of the SMS messages that we got. You could see the first time we ran through, we got that there was an ENH, or an enhanced SPC day 2 convective risk, and then we went through, made some modifications so that it would read better, that it would say the SPC has issued an enhanced risk of severe weather over a particular address, and then it also gives the valid time for that particular risk. So we wanted to do that because you never know who in the field is actually going to be receiving these. And the other thing that you can do as well is, if you had guys, say, working at an oil rig and they have a morning safety meeting shortly after these SPC risks come out, you could then modify the text in the output connector to have it say whatever you want. So if there's certain precautions that people need to know about and take place, you could put those instructions right into the output, whether it's an email or an SMS. So additional use cases, obviously across many industries, you can use weather data in the GeoEvent server to do things with real-time data. Insurance companies could take things like our hail swap polygons, you can intersect them with policies, you could come up with aggregated totals of possible exposure and loss estimates, along with other kind of strategic things as to where you might need to send employees, especially if it was maybe something more like a tornado rather than hail. Utilities, keeping track of lightning near substations and outdoor workers for safety. There's other things you could do where you can just use the GeoEvent server to handle our lightning data service. It's real-time lightning, but if you wanted to create an archive so that you could go do some analytics after the fact, or investigate, maybe if you had a wind turbine get struck or something like that, you could use the GeoEvent or the spatiotemporal big data store to store all of that information and query it out from a service after the fact, so you have archived access to the different data sets. And then obviously, like we talked about, situational awareness and drawing attention to critical things on an operations dashboard or a map, because you can utilize the GeoEvent server to change the symbology of a feature layer. So a couple of tips that we wish we would have had before we started playing with the GeoEvent server that hopefully make it easier on other people is kind of thinking of the point assets that we were alerting on as the geofences, which kind of seems counterintuitive or almost like a misnomer. But once we kind of got past that point, it was really easy to get rolling with that particular project and use case. Also, carefully consider just how often you're pinging a data service. It's kind of funny, Rennie, I've talked to customers who have utilized our map services, and then all of a sudden we see a huge spike in their usage, and it's almost like they hit every service at a 1 second interval. And I normally I can call them or email them and say, hey, you guys are playing with the GeoEvent server. Tell me what you're doing. And they normally have a really cool use case, but it seems to be very common that people kind of hit the data too frequently. And I guess it's kind of a testament to Esri and Amazon, because we've had that happen several times and the usage has gone up real high, but we've never had any problems with it. It's just kind of unnecessary load. And
those are the types of things too that as a staff or in our customer success team, and I know you, Matt, is we can always provide advice on what intervals to use depending on the data set. Like you said, with the SPC outlooks, depending on the day, you know, a day 3 only comes out 1 time a day, a day 2 only comes out twice, whereas lightning is a very critical thing, and you might want to have a pretty rapidly updating interval where you pull data. And so, you know, those are the types of things we want to be able to consult with you on, and how to use the data in the best way possible while still being efficient.
Yeah, exactly. And all that stuff's documented, but it's no fun to read that kind of stuff. So it's easy and fun to help people out with those kind of situations and solve those problems. And then the last thing is just that field splitter comes in handy with the process that we had to be able to send one alert to one device. Otherwise, we kept running into situations where I was getting a text message for any of our locations we had in there, and that wasn't what we were after. So it's a cool thing. It's out there. It's free. So check it out. We can go to some questions here in a sec, Rennie, if there are any. But one thing I do want to let everybody know is if you'd like to play around with any of our GIS, our Esri data services that come from our ArcGIS server infrastructure, by all means, let us know. It's super easy to set up a short trial for that. We can give you credentials to the data services, the REST endpoints, and people can connect to those really easy to play around with them, whether they want to do something in the GeoEvent processor server, or if they just want to play in ArcGIS Online or Portal and create some dashboards or whatnot that would be useful for their business cases.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and I put a note in the chat if anybody was able to see that here in the Zoom webinar. But you know, if you have questions, please feel free to ask. Matt, if you know, we'll give people a minute or two to type in any questions they might have. We haven't had any yet. But if you had to kind of sum up, you know, our ease of use of our data in the Esri platform for Esri users, how would you kind of describe that, just from an overarching view, not necessarily this particular use case, but of all the data services we have available?
You know, Rennie, I provide and I work with people for data services both in and outside of the Esri environment, and it's a much more difficult process to provide our other data services to somebody, because typically you have to find a stakeholder who's got a use case, who's interested, then they have to find a developer who has to get tasked in a sprint to go through and evaluate our information or our data service, and that person unfortunately has to read through documentation, which isn't fun for anybody, and then try to come up and implement it. You know, if we provide our data services, our Esri data services to anybody that has an Esri background, it's literally plug and play. I mean, most of the time I just give people credentials and access to the REST endpoints, and they dump it right into ArcGIS Online or their portal instance or ArcMap or ArcGIS for desktop and for Pro now, and they're off and running, and they're able to really quickly just kind of pull up all the services and visualize them, and then they kind of get what they can do with it from there. So it makes it much easier. It's just so much, I guess, frictionless is kind of
frictionless, sure,
the word to describe it.
And there are so many different types of data available, ranging from radar to satellite, lightning, surface observations, watches and warnings, etc. There's really a plethora of information, not just in the United States, but you know, really becoming global as well.
Yeah, it all started out 3 or 4 years ago, where we really started building our suite of real-time Esri products using the ArcGIS server. And so it's been a lot of real-time focused or short-term forecasts. Hopefully, we're going to be rolling out a whole bunch of new map services soon that have a lot of archive and forecast abilities. So we'll definitely be letting people know when those become operational here soon.
Excellent. Well, that will wrap up today's webinar. We really appreciate you joining us today, listening in, and we invite you to visit our website, wdtinc.com. There's a place to fill out a form there if you want us to talk with you directly about maybe some use cases or problems you're trying to solve in the Esri infrastructure, and we can work with anybody and provide any data type that of weather data that can help you out. And if you have questions along the way, just please ask them. But again, we thank you for joining us for this webinar today. Thank you, Matt, for going through this presentation, and we hope everyone has a great day. Thanks again.